Cost of quality, studies show that upwards of 30% of your gross revenue is being eaten or lost in poor processes or things that are just not going well. And so that's why continuous improvement is so important. A lot of companies I've gone to companies where they're measuring 30, 40 things, and it's just way too much, doesn't add value. So whatever you do in the business, it's got to be a metric that tells you what's happening with the business.
Welcome to KPI Fireside. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. In every episode, we explore the spark, the moment, the mindset, or the method that ignites real change. Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, you'll find the insights and inspiration to fuel your next improvement. Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. I am your host, Keith Norris, and our guest today is Robert Luna. Bob brings over 30 years of experience in scaling businesses from 3 million to over 500 million, has had leadership roles at Amazon, Procter & Gamble, and across high-tech, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals. With a master's in business administration, in marketing, and a career spanning from scheduling to CEO, Bob is deeply Gemba-driven and results-oriented, using Lean Six Sigma and customer feedback to optimize processes and ensure every step adds value. Welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Hey, thank you, Keith. I'm really happy to be here and just chat it up for a bit.
We like to start this segment. We call this the spark, but my question is, was there a time in your career early on where you decided that you wanted to make this continuous improvement thing, however you refer to it, part of your journey? Do you remember where that journey started for you?
Yeah, it was actually my first management job. I was working in Mexico at a maquiladora, and I was materials manager. And it was a medical device company. I never had any experience with medical device. As I got in there, they had a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. But one of the things that they really wanted me to work on is SOPs and process validation and product validation. I'm going, what the heck is all that? And why do you need all this? Why do I got to write procedures and all these type of things? And so that was really eye opening for me in my career. And that was really the start of lean. They didn't call it lean at that point, but medical device is super critical in all of our lives, and the ability to make a product that is not going to hurt somebody is super critical. Obviously, customer satisfaction is number one. In order to do that, you got to have optimal processes from start to finish. And then the feedback coming from customers is absolutely critical. So I learned an awful lot there. I was only there for just over 2 years, but that was really the start of becoming a really process-oriented individual.
Do you remember your actual job title there when you were that role that you were in?
Yeah, I do because I remember applying for it. And as I said, it was my first manager job. I wasn't going to get the job. They didn't offer it to me. They offered it to somebody else. And the person got another job, and so they were in a panic, and they said, "Okay, well, how about you? Will you come on in and join us?" And it was materials management. So it was all, warehouse distribution, scheduling, ERP, everything revolving around a manufacturing plant.
And it sounds like you were introduced to this, again, there's lots of different words for this thing we call continuous improvement. I'm sure you have some labels that you like to put on it, but what it was introduced to you early on as like processes and procedures. Is that how you got your
Yeah,
introduction?
that's really the key there. So I had to develop a really strong relationship with the quality manager. He probably didn't like me at first because he'd be asking for process information, and I would drag my feet. I wasn't sure what he was asking for, but we became really good friends over that period of time once I understood what it was that he was looking for. So as new products came through the operation, as we developed new products or new processes, we had to go through process and product validation. And I was heavily involved in that. And so I had to write SOPs that supported our GMPs and making sure that we're FDA compliant. So that was really at a very high level, if you think about it, as compared to lean and standardization, things of that nature.
Could you define GMP for us?
good manufacturing processes.
Awesome. I love we have a lot of acronyms that we like to talk
Right.
about on this podcast, and not everybody's familiar with them, so I like to clarify.
Well, the FDA, in terms of medical manufacturing, they're out there, they're on site. We're going through inspections and those type of things. So compliance is really, really critical in everything that we do.
Yeah, I know that, particularly with the FDA, there's a lot of requirements and process and a lot of things to do there. So that sounds like it was getting thrown into the deep end of the pool with some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a fire hose. It was a lot of learning. But here's the thing, kind of the question that you have, well, how did I get started in this? It's always been a baseline for me in everything that I do. And I don't forget that. And I use that in every business I've been in since. And I have a lot of medical manufacturing, background, but working like at Amazon or Procter and Gamble, they weren't medical device, but I could use these same things I learned, these same processes to make the business better.
So, yeah, I'm curious if we were to follow your journey along from this medical device manufacturing, kind of your first introduction to SOPs and processes, maybe you could just fill in some of the highlights of your journey, maybe another organization that you went to, some other milestone where you learned about some new piece of this puzzle that brings you to where you're at today.
Yeah. So as I moved through my career, I moved into medical implants. And this was also a milestone for me. I was the vice president of manufacturing and went into a company. They're about $18 million. It was run by a doctor, and he was a dentist. And they were in all sorts of hurt financially with FDA. They just had all sorts of problems. And it was just really due to lack of process. He was getting ready to sell the business on the open market for, pennies. Actually, not pennies, but $15 million. And so I came on board. I said, well, let's not do that. Let's take a look and put together a plan, find out where the problem points are. Let's put together some solutions to get you in the right direction. And we were able to do that. And so they had a lot of problems with FDA. We got those all fixed. And so they're fully compliant from an FDA standpoint. We got production up and we got the business really moving forward. And after about 3 years, 3.5 years, he ended up selling the business for $125 million.
Wow.
So that was really another milestone in terms of leading pretty much end to end operation. I didn't have the sales and marketing responsibility, but I interacted significantly with them in terms of what we're doing. But the ability to help a business to scale and to get their processes ready for scaling and that they're repeatable is something that I'm really proud of. And that's a lot of my background experience you kind of mentioned in the bio is that the ability to scale businesses. And a lot of people just don't know how to do that.
And tell us where you're at today.
Yeah, so I work here in Las Vegas. It's actually starting to cool down. It's in the mid 90s right now. I've been with a company called Essler Companies for just about 7 years. And what they do is they're part of the Renewal by Anderson network. Probably everybody's heard that, doors and windows. And Essler Companies has 9 affiliates, and I work for them. And so I'm working out of this area here in Las Vegas. And it's the same thing. We've scaled the business, let's see, about fivefold over that period of time since I've been there.
And what are some of the challenges that you've seen there where this tool set of continuous improvement has been helpful for you?
Well, when I got there, everything was on paper. Even though they had some systems, they weren't using that. So it's the ability to put together a plan and implement the plan and monitor the plan and make the changes as we move along. There was a lot of processes that were not documented and a lack of standardization in terms of how we drove the business. So we have probably fixed almost every part of the business in terms of process improvement. One of the first things that we did was you build a plan of how you're going to install doors and windows in a house. And everything was, handwritten, those type of things. So the first thing we did is we got them into a system and like an ERP system. and the ability to track what was going on and to have a standard process of doing that was a night and day for the whole business. And that really started the business moving along a path of scaling because they weren't able to scale. If you can imagine doing hundreds and thousands of jobs and not having a good solid process to manage that.
I'm curious, as you've, through your career, medical device to windows and doors, some differences there. I'm curious if there's some things that you find, even though it's different industries, that there's some common patterns that you face in helping a company create processes and scale or get ready to scale.
Yeah, for sure. I think that th- the lack of a documented process just opens up the business for a multitude of problems. And like we talked about earlier, from an FDA standpoint, if you're doing a medical device, if you can't have a repeatable product in terms of what's going into a person's body, that's a real problem. Now, if you're making some other widget, it's still a problem because the product that goes to the customer might not work, customer dissatisfaction, those type of things. So at the end of the day, really, it's about having a good mapped out process with checkpoints and the ability to measure how you're performing, and then having a plan in place to be able to uh, modify, improve, and optimize as you go along. Standard work is really super critical of this. And then when you have a problem, then what do you do? And a lot of people don't know what to do. And so what ends up happening is people become firefighters. And this is what I see in most businesses I've worked at. As I go in and all they're doing is fighting fires. They're not fixing anything. They're not getting to the root cause and eliminating the problem as they move along. So that's a consistent problem that I see everywhere. And I've seen it in a $3 million business and I've seen it in a $500 million business. You would think that a Fortune 20 company would have their act together, but they didn't. And so you see these recurring problems. The other challenge I see is capability. So if you have a great process, but you haven't built capability and you haven't trained or you don't have trained programs, don't have the right people in place, then those processes are not going to work as intended. So the ability to, kind of map out that process and then build out that capability that people that need to run that process is probably the biggest things I see over and over again in terms of business growth, achieving customer satisfaction. And so you have two customers, right? One is the customer that you sell to, and then the other one is your internal customer, right? The owners, the board, the stockholders, those type of things. So you got to be able to drive your business to meet both of those needs. So those are really some really common themes that I see, throughout the business.
Bob, you and I have had some conversations about specific metrics, things that you're measuring to use to evaluate how successful you're being with your processes. I'm curious if you want to maybe go into a few of those that are top of mind recently or that you've been working on as
Yeah,
recently.
yeah, for sure. Throughput is a super critical one. Okay, so the customer has an expectation of how long something should take. Throughput and turnover time is really super critical. So that's the one customer. The other customer, the business, is they want really optimal throughput, right? And they want that throughput to be accurate. So measuring cycle time and then defects at the back end are really two important measurements that we really take a really hard look at on a daily basis. What is the output? What was the plan? And did we hit the plan? And then if we didn't hit the plan, why? Okay. What's the reasons? A lot of people don't do that, and dig deep enough. They don't get to the root cause. They don't do like a five whys and kind of really work their way on through that. So it's really about throughput and about accuracy and defects. I mean, defects leads into all the other eight waste and 6S and all these other things. But those are really probably two of the critical metrics that we take a look at on a daily basis.
You were hinting at a process or a ritual that I like to think about and talk about as business review or like paying attention to the metrics. I'm curious if you could maybe give us a specific example of maybe a certain area of the business where there's a particular metric that you use. How do you recommend these teams that are interested in process improvement that they do that periodic look at the data? Maybe you could explain one of those type of business reviews for us.
Well, I think a lot of it starts with mapping out the process to begin with. And value stream of process is not a really complicated effort, right? You can go into a conference room and use little post-it notes as what's step one, step two, step three, step four, and then where are the critical measurement points in there? How are you going to measure it, and then what do you do with that data? So some data we take a look at on a daily basis, which is super critical. Other data we're going to look at on a weekly basis. We might have a team that will sit together and take a look and see how we are progressing from week to week. One of the measurements we have where we're at right now is called billables. And what that is that if we mismeasure something that goes in the customer's house or we order the product wrong, we got to reorder it. That's a billables. Okay. So while we have to react quickly when we discover that to get something reordered so we could take care of the customer, we'll take a look at that on a monthly basis. We get all the data and take a look and see, how many defects that had, what the costs were. And then from there, start to develop corrective action effort, okay, to improve because the defects can happen at any point in the process of the business. And that's why the value stream is really important so that you know what you need to measure. So some of your measurement could be daily, it could be weekly, it could be monthly.
I'm curious, since you've worked across different industries, are there certain metrics or that are just good to measure regardless of what industry you're in, the kinds of things that you want to measure? You mentioned like throughput. Curious if there's some other examples that come to mind.
Yeah, I think those, throughput, mistakes and errors are probably the ones that are driving everything that's happening in a business. And we're obviously taking a look at the P&L. We're taking a look at shipments. We're taking a look at revenue. We're taking a look like on sales. We're looking at close rates. We we are going to you know try to focus on the main metrics that tell us how well the business is doing. A lot of companies I've gone to companies where they're measuring 30, 40 things, and it's just way too much, doesn't add value. So whatever you do in the business, it's got to be a metric that tells you what's happening with the business.
This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire, the all in one platform for continuous improvement. With KPI Fire, you can align strategy, drive execution, and engage your people. So, whether you're leading a team or driving enterprise wide change, KPI Fire helps you deliver real results. Learn more at www.kpifire.com. So, Bob, what is it that you like about the Net Promoter Score as a metric?
So we have a couple measurement points, and everybody's a little different in terms of surveying the customer. So when a salesperson goes out to sell the job, they'll send out a survey afterwards to see how well that they did. Then when we install the job, then we also send out a survey. And what we're looking for is we're looking for the highest score that we possibly can. And and they'll be a range. Typically nines and tens is what everybody is hoping for from a business standpoint. And then you start to get down into the lower levels to see kind of customer dissatisfaction and then a real high level of dissatisfaction. And then what we want to really do with that when we get the surveys is to reach out to the customer, make sure we understand where their dissatisfaction is. And then from there, then we can take it back to the business to figure out what can we do better. Like a metric, a lot of companies you had asked about other metrics. Another metric that comes to mind would be drop calls and customer connections and those type of things. So a lot of times surveys come back and the doors and windows or the widgets went in perfectly, but they had a hard time reaching customer service, right? Or, they talked to customer service and they never responded back with a solution to whatever their problem is. So that type of information is super critical for us. And then from there, then we could take a look at our value stream and go back and see what can we improve, from a business standpoint. Then you're not guessing. The problem with that is, or the downside, or not the downside, but it's reactive what we really want to do is continue to work the business so it becomes proactive, so that we're looking at the process and optimizing it before it becomes a problem. But it's invaluable to have those surveys come back. A lot of companies do it and they don't do anything with it. Okay, so that's really the critical piece. Collecting metrics, collecting data, if you don't do anything with it, then you've just wasted time, right?
Bob, you were talking to me the other day about a process that you like to use, and you were talking about like EQ, and you had a couple of acronyms there, but it was something kind of unique that you have applied. I'm curious if you could tell us about that little system that you've got.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty big system. It's a pretty big business across this country, right? We know there's a lot of books that people write, and I'm big about reading books and learn what I can, but apply just what you can out of the book. Not everything's going to apply to the business. So I'm a bit of a old school guy. I'm pretty pragmatic about how we do things, and if I go someplace and I see that something is broken, to me it's pretty straightforward. Let's go fix it. Why can't you see that? I see it. It's pretty easy. And then working with people, it's like, what do you mean you don't see what the vision is and what we're doing? And because I've been there and I've seen how it works, I know what's going to happen on the other end, but people don't know that. And so over the last few years, I've come to learn in order for us to drive lean and continuous improvement across the business, people have to be prepared to drive lean and continuous improvement across the business. So EQ is how people act from an emotional standpoint. What's their ability to understand? What's their self-awareness? How do they deal with emotions? And are they in a proper place to be able to improve something? Because when you go in or you have a meeting and say, hey, your process is broken, if they don't have that EQ, okay, they don't have that self-awareness or those self-awareness tools, what do you think happens? Okay, they shut down, they get defensive, we can't move the needle, that, hey, I don't have a problem, my department's fine, why are you bugging me? And then you have relationship issues, right? So that's the EQ part. And there's a lot of good studies out there that shows, IQ, what you have, what I have, that's it. We can't change that. Now we can study, we can learn, but ultimately at the end of the day, our IQ is really kind of what we're born with. Q, okay, is the number one predictor of workplace performance, is what studies are showing out there. So people and their EQ, if we can improve that, and then they're better prepared to launch into improving the business. So if I don't have the people in the right place, and this is something that I've learned, and you can't teach old dog new tricks and that kind of stuff. And I've really come to embrace that. Now, EQ, I've taken classes and I'm certified in it, those type of things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's working with people to really understand how they deal with their emotions and how they can become more self-aware, socially aware. Because not only your self-awareness, but social awareness, right? It's a couple elements in there that you got to be able to deal with your own emotions and how do you deal with other people. Because then that leads into the teamwork piece, right? If you're going to value stream something out. So it's beautiful about how it ties into that. I use a lot of terms. I'm going, "Oh, that's lean. You know, that's kind of a Kaizen approach. Okay, that's a Toyota, approach. They don't understand that necessarily. They talk a little bit about how just business improves in general. So that's the EQ. The other part of it that we're working on, and it's a corporate wide effort, is extreme ownership. And I don't know if you've ever seen this book. I'll throw this up here. So, it's how U.S. Navy SEALs lead and how they win, and kind of what they did in the battle field, in terms of wars. And obviously, kind of like medical devices, if you're in war, you're talking about life and death.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of great concepts in there about ownership. Okay, so it's one thing: are you emotionally prepared, right? So EQ, and then, well, do you own it? Okay, and a lot of people don't own it, right? If they don't own it, then it's somebody else's problem. They're not being proactive. They're not staying on top of this. And so this all really kind of ties into how we kind of mirror these things together. And if the people are properly prepared, then we're going to move the business a lot quicker. a lot faster. People are going to be more engaged. We're going to have better decision making. We're going to have improved coping. Professional relationships are going to be better. And a lot of these things they talk about in Toyota, they just don't talk about it from that standpoint. The emotional side of things, I just really, like I said, I really never got it, but I get it now. And so I'm just a lot more aware of things that we need to do prep wise in order to launch into really effective process improvement.
Is this I find this really interesting. I mean, we talk a lot about processes and process improvement methodologies and things like that. It's very tool oriented, but I think what I hear you saying are two things that I mean, EQ is emotional quotient. I mean, it's EQ, but you have this like extreme ownership piece, which to me feels like kind of a mindset thing. How would you describe those two? It sounds like pillars that go with your process improvement methods. Is that how you think about them?
Yeah, so we and this is something that is super critical to our business is, our training. And training is super critical to the business. So, if you work your way back from NPS, right, in terms of unhappy customer, it could be a broken process. A lot of times it's a training issue and it's maybe an issue that an employee just, it's an execution issue. They're just not very good at talking to customers, those type of things. So these are pillars in terms of training of having people to be, socially and self-aware to be able to deal with the things that go on in a business.
So how do you evaluate or improve this EQ piece? Is this something you do in the hiring process, or is this something you do as part of the training process?
So I think it's both. I think there's certain things that we're looking for when we're hiring people. It's part of onboarding and getting people aware of what the expectations are. Okay. And these are areas that you need to own and you need to improve, right? You need to own your process, but you also need to own your emotions and those type of things. And, kind of an EQ strategy is, are you ready for change? And you know that if a business, if you come in and a business is doing 4% EBITDA, there's going to be a lot of change. There's a lot of things that are going to need to be fixed. Don't know where they're at till you get going. So people got to be prepared for what's going on. The better that people are prepared for change, okay, and then they're prepared for the change, and then they're prepared to own their process, okay, then the better off we're going to be as we move through the system. I own that process. Okay, so I better fix that. Okay, and then I better be proactive and look for better ways to improve it. Okay, and emotionally, I know that a customer survey came back and the problem that they're talking about is a communication problem in our department. Okay, I'm ready for that. Okay, I'm emotionally set that I'm going to get feedback and I'm going to be able to improve what I do and make my job better, make the customer, happier. And the when we take a look at value streaming and people, a lot of times what they do in terms of mapping out a process, they just map out the process in their department. Okay, but you got to look at the process end to end. So, like a person that's working in a warehouse, if we don't, tune them in as to what's happening with the customer, how they make that connection, right? How do they buy into these type of things that we're doing? So the ability to get people to really understand what happens at the very back end, really helps it drive the business. So these are just some really key pillars. And once you get through these, you start accelerating improvement across the business.
I'm curious, like, to get into, somebody wants to bite down on this idea of emotional intelligence and how they can either improve their team or themselves in this. Is there something that you use in the training, a story or like, I don't know, a way of helping people recognize this or training people on that? How do you go about teaching that?
So there's a couple of ways. First of all, through I don't know if you've seen the book here, but for Talent Smart, they're experts in EQ. So they have a test that we put people through. Okay, it's a
Okay.
simple test, and what you do is you answer a lot of questions, and it tells you where your EQ is at okay, and self-awareness management, and social awareness and social interaction, those type of things. So the test comes out and it really starts to tell you where are the areas that you can improve. And then what we do is we set them up with a plan, maybe what their lowest score might be based on what they've and how they've answered the questions. And then from there, we set a training plan on a strategy or two to improve on and making them more aware of those. So when you do that, you've really got to drive that across the business. So what we do is for EQ is we train on a particular strategy or subject every single month. We do it in stand-ups, but where it really is a big driver is one-on-ones. Okay. And then getting people to understand that, once again, where there's a problem across the business, you can typically drive it back to EQ strategy. And so it's up to leaders and managers to identify, hey, we're having a lot of mistakes, okay, in ordering or something like that. Okay. And then to sit down to say, well, the person sucks, they don't care, but to try to drive down and figure out what is it that where we can help them on this, okay? And so that's really kind of the big driver on the EQ.
I think that's kind of interesting, the connection of extreme ownership and emotional intelligence, because you could almost think about those two things as like not necessarily opposite ends, but they kind of pull in a tension sort of way. Like ownership really pulls you into saying, "This is me, this is mine." But then the emotional intelligence that you're referring to is like you kind of have to separate yourself from the identity of it's my process to be aware of like it's just the process and I need to be open to improving it without feeling like that's an attack on me. So I think that's really kind of an interesting way that you put those two things together.
Yeah, and, so I just, come to realize that there's other elements to lean and process improvement that can help to accelerate it. We can still go out and do a Kaizen or a plan, do, check, and act or these type of things and do a process improvement and, identify the problem and put together a solution and work it. But, beyond that is if everybody on that team is properly prepared and there's ownership, then it just moves the needle a lot quicker.
So I'm curious, inside the organization, continuous improvement, this mindset, and the way you're talking about the EQ, the emotional intelligence, and the extreme ownership, it seems to me like there might be different ways that this is either taught or absorbed or displayed inside of the organization. Could you give us an example of what one of these means at the in the call center versus in a manager supervisor layer versus senior leadership?
Well, I'll be honest with you is that in the businesses I've seen over the years, that extreme ownership and emotional intelligence is needed at all levels. And if you don't have it at the senior level, okay, it's going to be really hard to get it at the lower level in terms of taking a look at these strategies in terms of how to. So for part of the planning in order to implement this core curriculum, what I'm driving is not only do we train a large group every single month by function, we're also going to train the leaders at the same time because we can't I can't drive success if the leaders aren't behind it and if they don't understand it, right? So we will take a look at a topic like, maybe self-awareness 1 month, and then we'll, skip a month, and then the following month we'll come back into like social awareness. What happens in between is one-on-ones, assessment testing, okay, and role playing. So a really big part of what we're seeing is the ability to convert this into real life scenarios. It's the same way of lean as being able to tell them the why. But if you could show a person that their communication shuts down every time we have a discussion about a problem, say like an ordering or customer service, and it's you know social awareness, the inability to communicate or take feedback or give feedback and those type of things. That's where that really starts to help. So you train on the topics, but then you got to follow up with one-on-ones on a regular basis and talk about people, talk about their skill sets, what's happening, how they're delivering results, and then also do the role playing. So I think the role playing becomes even more important once you get past the topics. so people can understand, how to have a tough conversation with somebody. And from there, then they get better, more comfortable at, communicating, and then they're better teamwork. And then obviously then process improvement really starts to blossom.
I'm picking up on some things that I think would be really interesting to our listeners here. Just for the sake of context, how many employees are in your organization?
In our group here is about 200, just over 200.
200. And how many different sites or locations does that represent?
The 2 main sites would be in Las Vegas and then
So
in Reno.
okay, the two
And then
sites.
we have a smaller group, a growing area in Southern Utah, and then a small group in, Arizona.
I think with this continuous improvement thing, sometimes particularly folks that are passionate about this, excited about this, and are thinking, man, there's really something to this. My organization needs this. There's oftentimes this question of like, yes, we all know that it's important. We all know that we should do it, but how do we actually do it? And I think you were kind of touching on some behavior patterns or rituals or training events like appointments in the calendar where you have these things. I wonder if we could punctuate those a little bit. So for senior leadership, what does it look like? How often do you interact with senior leadership, and is it part of another meeting? Is it a dedicated meeting?
Yeah, this would be a dedicated meeting. We should talk about topics and key metrics and, kind of what's happening in the business on a weekly basis. But the training that revolves around emotional intelligence and extreme ownership, and if you take a look in terms of kind of what that layout is, you have to talk about lean, and the other part of this is safety. So there are other elements in this, and it's on the calendar, and it's going to be on a monthly basis with the leadership team. Same thing for as you kind of move down throughout the organization, there has to be some concept that's being taught every single month. It has to be on the calendar. So if we take a look at metrics or even scheduling or customer appointments, those type of things, if you don't set up a solid schedule and if you don't have that commitment from top to bottom, things will not move along like you would like them to be. So it's a metric in terms of, from my standpoint, this is what I would coach organizations on, is to be able to set it up on a calendar basis, okay, and have a committee also to take a look at the results that we're getting, a committee that would meet once a month to see, well, how do we train? How do we do things a little differently? How do we do role playing a little differently? And, start to develop this database of tools for people to look at. But I think what you're asking is this needs to be hardline scheduled. You can't just talk to them once, onboarding, give them a book and hope it works. It just doesn't work.
Organizations use different words to describe things like core values and mission and strategic themes and strategic pillars. I'm curious if this EQ and ownership is this like all the way down at the core values level of like this is who we are as an organization, or is this kind of like part of a strategic theme like in 2025 this is our kind of our thrust.
So I think every business is a little different. And I think things are evolving. And when I can get into a business and I can work with them and show the value to the senior leaders, then it becomes part of the core values, right? So, we want high customer satisfaction, we want employee satisfaction. Those are a couple of really core values, and it ties into EQ as well as lean and safety and those type of things. So it's strategic in nature, but it really should become something that people are very ingrained in. It just becomes part of the life of the business. And if you can get to that point, okay, which is always a big lift, depending on what the priority is of the day, people will understand what that return on investment is. And there's a lot of studies out there, but the key, Keith, is how to drive the business so this is happening on a regular basis. So this is a big part of my responsibility in terms of driving this forward. And as I talk to a lot of people and they ask for input and what can they do better, I'm leaning more towards, well, let's do the legwork first. Okay. Now let's get the pillars down and then we can parallel path on them, but the ability to get employee engagement is just super critical if you're going to improve what we're doing.
So with this idea of improvement, let's talk about this. I don't know what term you guys use in your organization, but let's say like value add associate, folks that maybe work in the call center or just kind of the newest, most entry level positions in the organization. How are they taught about their role in process improvement or making things better? Is there a framework or, a training that you guys use?
Yeah, this is really kind of this is the future. I think this is the framework here in terms of ownership, and a lot of employees don't think like that, and then also making the connection for them on the very back end in terms of customers. So if they own the process, then I can teach them that they need to improve the process. And so these go really hand in hand. And if you take a look at some of the training on extreme ownership, they do talk about improving process and those type of things. They use some loose terms as it relates to continuous improvement. I'm surprised they aren't using some of the lean terms, but you know, continuous improvement is a term that I'm starting to use more and more instead of lean. And here's the reason for that is while I still use the word lean, I put in front of it continuous improvement because people a lot of times when they hear lean, what do they think? They think manufacturing, they think Toyota. What does that have to do with finance or sales or customer service? But everybody can understand continuous improvement. And then showing them how NPS and customer satisfaction can drive back down into continuous improvement and then leaning out the processes is super critical. So everybody understands NPS and everybody's looking at the surveys and everybody knows that they need to improve their ownership and their emotional intelligence. Then the lean piece just becomes a lot less complicated.
I find that super interesting, the topic of how do you refer to this discipline of continuous improvement versus lean? Because obviously there's a lot of history and knowledge of what lean is, but there's also a lot of negativity, really. It's like people have had lean used as a cost cutting measure or a headcount reduction measure, and it can kind of get a bad reputation. But yeah, that's interesting that you're shifting towards.
Yeah, I think part of that is the extreme ownership and the emotional intelligence of senior leaders. So if we're going to expect that out of the frontline people working in the warehouse or installing, the senior leaders need to have that same emotional intelligence. They got to be open to feedback, right? And they got to be able to be transparent. And so when they do that and they can see the return on investment and they can make those connections, because a lot of times people just don't make those connections. And we talked about this earlier when we go into business or I go into a business and they're struggling. A lot of times it's, as I said, capability, building capability and improving processes, those type of things. A lot of it's leadership. And you got to have also the leadership in lean. And that's why I like the, kind of the Toyota way in terms of the involvement of leadership. So if people can understand continuous improvement that improves the bottom line or the top line, then it's a little easier draw to get them in to the table to discuss about some of these processes. The other thing that we do from a lean standpoint is I do teach off of this book here. You probably have seen this. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. As always the
I love
backwards
book
here.
recommendations.
Everything I know about lean, I learned in first grade. And I like teaching or using those concepts because what it does, it converts, complex, they're not complex terms, but terms that people don't understand. It converts them into something that they can understand. And when we walk them through what happened, in the first grade and how they can get together and go to the bathroom in order and there's chaos in the classroom, those type of things, and how it converts over into process improvement. So simplifying what we're doing, telling people about the why is probably bigger drivers and better ROI than just going out there and going, hey, this process is bad. We're going to get on the table. Let's map it out and those type of things. So I think a lot of that has to go hand in hand.
So Bob, if you were talking to somebody that's like a manager or supervisor inside of your organization or, and just in any organization, are there some like mindset, we want you to think like this. This is how we want you to think in your role as a leader, are there some insights that you could give us about that mindset?
Yeah, the extreme ownership is super critical. And you don't have to read the whole book. There's just a few key points in there. Okay. And there's no bad teams, only bad leaders. Now that sounds a little harsh, but leaders need to understand that, and they need to take the ownership of that. And so if somebody's performing poorly, okay, you own it. Okay. Now you got to figure out how to work with them and use the emotional intelligence to drive things through. And so no bad teams, only bad leaders. Check your ego. This is a real problem in every business I've been in. Everybody, has their egos. So those are kind of some really core things. The ability to be self-aware of what's going on, socially aware in terms of improved communication, giving feedback and taking feedback. Those are some really big drivers. And so if you're going to, and going back to extreme ownership, you own it. You own that process from start to finish. And if that process is not working, so then you can move into the lean part, right? And so value stream your process out. Okay. I think that's one of the most important, one of the most beneficial tools that you could use to lean it out, put those steps on there, however you do it. Okay. You use software. I use Visio, but I like just doing post-its on a board and then get the group together and go, does that add value? Okay. And do we have the right metrics in place? And if the metrics aren't being achieved, why? Okay, and well, the people don't care. Well, why don't they care? Well, I don't know, so you can't get them down to the 5 whys. So there's just kind of some 5, simple, was that 5? Is what I came up with, about 5 things there? 5 simple things to do to drive a business. But it's gotta be all across the business. It can't just be in employees. It's gotta be, from a leadership standpoint.
I want to kind of tee up for a little bit of what come back to a little bit of that. So I've heard the saying that people don't quit jobs, they quit managers. I'm curious if you could respond to that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I see a lot of that, and so you need to be able to understand why people are quitting. And is it you? Well, from extreme ownership standpoint, it is you. You need to get in there. You need to figure that out. So why some employees are going to leave for what they think are greener pastures, maybe benefits, or they're moving, or a little bit more money. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they're working in an environment that they're not very happy at. Okay, and I read some the other day that said somewhere around 50% of people are not very happy with what they're doing. And if you think about it, if they got a broken process and they're really frustrated with what they're doing, and they don't know how to improve that, well, then the lean comes in there. And then if they're the emotional intelligence, if there's no feedback and they're not ready for change, so all these elements really roll together really nicely. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the leader's responsibility to make for a good working environment. If there's challenges with the employee, you got to own it, and then use some of that ownership, use some of that EQ to reach out to the employee and find some solutions.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think I love the idea of extreme ownership all the way down to just the individual employee level. I think one thing that, like you said, there's a lot of people that are just not happy or completely satisfied in their job. And I think a lot of times that has to do with feeling like they don't have control. But I love the mindset of extreme ownership because being in charge of a big organization, I think a lot of people think, "Oh, I wanna be the boss because then I can just tell people what to do." But the truth is, nobody does anything they don't really wanna do anyways. And when you realize that you have control, that you can make a difference, it's one of our previous guests used the analogy of flipping the switch. It's like you can see people inside of the organization at every level go from being disengaged to, like, flipping the switch, like, "Wait a minute, I could actually make things better around here." This extreme ownership, this EQ thing that Bob's talking about, this lean, this continued improvement, there's something here that could allow me to make my job better, to make my coworkers happier, to make my life better, maybe even get me a promotion somewhere along the way.
Yeah,
So, that's one
and
thing I find really
there's
interesting.
another element to that. What I what they teach in these, under these concepts is not only doesn't make your job better, it makes your life better. Okay. And what I mean by that is if a person is very unhappy in their job, it's probably creating some stress. So there's probably health and other, uh, things that are going on. They might take it to their home, and so there's a lot of other side benefit, from a health and kind of medical standpoint of fixing your process. And so people don't necessarily get those connections, but when that light goes on, then they're engaged and things change. And all of a sudden your NPS scores, "Ah, well, this sucks. Why do I gotta talk to the customer?" "Oh, the customers hate everything once they make that connection about it's really about the customer and how I make for a great experience for the customer. And once you make that emotional connection and that ownership connection. And then you're also bringing back to the business ideas about how to improve that. Then all of a sudden things change and go, wow, this wasn't so hard. It wasn't so bad. Our scores are going through the roof. And there's a direct correlation, right? You can get your little graph and see what the correlation is there in terms of the train education. And we also go back to the fact is that most of the people that are doing the heavy lifting, they know where the problems are. It's up to us to provide the support and help to help them bring that to light and to fix it. And once they know the ownership and then they know their impact to them personally by improving, then we start to see some really good results. And hopefully at the end of the day, works your way up to kind of what the high level business goals are. But, it's hard to sustain something if you're just gonna go, "Well, sales suck, you guys gotta work harder," or "Profits suck, you gotta work harder." You gotta be able to drive it down to what can we fix that will drive that organically. You don't have working the top down doesn't work that well.
Bob, this has been a great conversation. I want to move into a little segment I like to call the rapid fire. So this is just a series of not necessarily one word, but short answer, one word, one phrase, just kind of fill in the blank on some of these. So I'll just throw a couple of them at you real quick here. The most important job of a leader is to blank.
Motivate their employees.
I like to ask about a book recommendation. You just shared a book with us. Do you want to just give us that book and title one more time?
Sure, I'll do that. It's Extreme Ownership by, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. So you have that, but I'm gonna share 3. Because we're talking about process improvement, everything I learned about lean, everything I know about lean, I learned in the first grade, and that's by Martichenko. But you should be able to, from that title, be able to get that off the internet. And Emotional Intelligence 2.0. So those are just some really great books, and get what you can out of them. So, and they have
Excellent.
training courses and classes and everything else on that. But anybody ever have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for them too.
That's great. Do you have a favorite go-to tool from like the lean toolbox that you like to turn to frequently?
Value
Value
stream
stream
mapping, and the 5 whys.
in the five whys.
I think plan, do, check, and act and A3s and all that other stuff. I think there's application for it. People can use it, but I really like the value streaming because that just really delivers a really strong message about what's going on in the business.
A man after my own heart. I frequently will say that flowcharts are my love language. So draw me a picture.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Visual.
Do you have a favorite question or a few favorite questions that you find yourself turning to a lot in these conversations?
That's really a good question. How are you feeling? Hey, do you have some feedback for me? What can I do to help? And I think those are the kind of the questions that I'm asking a lot more of than maybe, "Hey, why does your process suck?" I wouldn't use those terms, but, "Your process is broken, what's going on? But what can I do to help?" Okay? And so open the communication, put the person at ease, and, from there and then also listen. So it's not even just about asking a question. Show that you're gonna listen to what they have to say. Then from there, then you get, the information that you're looking for.
Excellent. I like it. That's a good one. Finish this sentence. Continuous improvement is
Continuous improvement is the lifeblood of a growing business. And if you're not improving, you're not just staying where you're at. You're dying. You're going backwards. If you're not improving, you're going to get passed by. You just are. And I one of the things, and we didn't talk about this, but one of the things that I also like, and I bring it up a lot, and people look at me like I'm crazy. I like to talk about cost of quality, and especially to senior leadership people. And cost of quality, studies show that upwards of 30% of your gross revenue is being eaten or lost in poor processes or things that are just not going well. And so that's why continuous improvement is so important. People, when you take a look at waste and things like that, people don't see it because it's buried right in payroll and all these other expenses that just roll through, and people don't understand that. Right? Hey, we didn't do this job right. Okay. Well, go fix it. But they don't think about the labor, the costs, the insurance, the gas, the vehicles, the wasted capacity, those type of things.
So much waste. It always blows my mind when I talk to companies of all different sizes. You think like when you're small, when we're a little bit bigger, all these problems will go away. But even the biggest companies everywhere have just versions of similar problems. It's just so interesting that there's
Well,
always problems to solve.
so I was reading, or not reading, I was watching your one of the podcasts, and they talked about maybe the differences between a small business and a big business. So in a small business, things can maneuver, you can maneuver around a lot quicker. And then in a bigger business, even though maybe have more resources, the ability to move the needle becomes a lot more complicated. You have a lot more layers of people and those type of things, and people just become so isolated and their silos and all these other things. Similar to what you see in a smaller business, but they're right there in the bigger business. So, they grow because they have a product that somebody likes, right? But they're using the same process that just is really not really effective. And if you're a company that's making $1 billion in profit, you know, you don't think too much about that wasted cost. When I worked at Procter and Gamble, I was talking to a finance guy, and I go, "Well, we're wasting $100,000 here. We really should fix this and put together a team to do it." And this individual told me, he says, "Well, it's just a rounding error." And those type of things are just really hurt me, with me being a continuous improvement guy. What he doesn't know, or what he doesn't understand, is that if you're losing 30%, from cost to quality or cost to poor quality, it's not 30%, let's say it's $100 million. It's not one place, it's not one process, right? It's a
Exactly.
lot
Yeah.
of 20, $30,000 misses all along the business, everywhere across the business. And I see that in all businesses. And people go, "Well, that's just a small change of $2,000." Well, it's $2,000 a month, and you multiply that by 150 times, it adds up really, really quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely an art to get people to see the waste in a way that gets them to take action. Bob, let me ask you this. If there was a message that you could get to somebody who is maybe on the periphery of this continuous improvement thing, and they're just, they happen to just be listening to this section, and you're trying to encourage them to dig a little deeper, is there something that you might say to somebody who you just had a few seconds with?
That's a really good question. I think what you want to do is you want to find somebody that can provide some help or some guidance. A lot of times, what I've found throughout my career is you might be in the company, you might screaming your head off about fixing something, but somebody from the outside comes in and provides a little different perspective. Or reach out to somebody that spend an hour. Just find somebody that will give you an hour of time and just kind of walk through what we've done here, on this podcast, and let them kind of talk you through maybe the steps of how to set this up and how to approach your business. The problem that I see with um, some of the companies, what I'm seeing, I mean, I think they're trying to hire people from the outside to come in and to help, which is good. They should do that. You got to make sure you have somebody that has the experience. I've worked with consultants before, and the ability to find somebody that really has the hands-on experience versus the practical knowledge, and the theoretical, are two different things. And so find somebody that actually has a hands-on, that has gone through that. And if you can do that, then you'll be miles ahead. The other thing I would say, it's an investment, but the ROI is massive. So, if you're able to get with somebody that can help you to, kind of build out the ROI, that would probably be my advice. Getting a book, take a seminar, none of that is gonna hurt, and it could be a benefit. But if you're able to talk to somebody and just reach out to them, a lot of people are willing to help and, give some advice and things like that. And then also,
Wonderful.
invest in the tools. I like, having a system that, can help you along the way too.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, Bob, last question here. This one's just a little bit philosophical. It's kind of a fun one I like to just think about. Speaking of like success broadly as an individual, is it more important to feel successful or be successful?
It's a really good question. I think there's a couple of elements to that. So you want to be successful in terms of your job and your work. Okay. Part of it, a lot of times, you're not going to get the recognitions. You got to also feel that you did a good job. So you got to feel successful. So a lot of times that's what I have to rely on. For me, I'm going, yeah, I nailed that. I know I did a good job, whether I get the recognition or not. But I also want to be successful in terms of delivering results. And I feel like in my career, I've been able to do that. I've been lucky because I've been surrounded by good people. We've been able to deliver some world class stuff that, if I ever had the time to write a book, I mean, I've just seen some crazy stuff throughout my career. But companies can change and they can be successful. But there is, you know, a specific approach that you need to take on that.
Bob, this has been a super interesting conversation. I'm grateful for you coming and joining us on the podcast today. Are you willing to share any information on LinkedIn or connection information if somebody wanted to follow up with you? How could they get in touch with you?
Yeah, through LinkedIn, that would be fine. So I'd be happy to. Anybody just wants to chat for whatever reason, I'd be happy to do that and give them some guidance.
Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We appreciate your time and your experience. For anybody listening, if you'd like to suggest a guest or ask a question or give us ideas for future episodes, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, Keith Norris, and you can connect with Bob also, as he mentioned. This concludes this episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you have enjoyed the episode today, please be sure to like or follow or subscribe or drop a little comment in there. We'd love to see your questions and comments on things, and share it with your friends who are passionate about continuous improvement as you are. And until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change.